Scary telling.
As I continued driving down the dark, empty highway, I couldn't shake the image of the mangled corpse from my mind. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that it wasn't just a deer or some other animal. There was something about the way the bones were arranged that didn't make sense. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise coming from the back of my truck. It sounded like something was scratching at the metal. I pulled over and got out to investigate, shining my flashlight on the trailer. To my horror, I saw scratch marks on the metal, as if something had been trying to claw its way inside. I quickly got back into my truck and sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced in my rearview mirror, I half expected to see something chasing me. Eventually, I came to a small town and stopped at a gas station to fill up. As I was pumping gas, I overheard a group of locals talking about a string of disappearances in the area. They spoke in hushed tones, and I couldn't make out all of the details, but what I heard was enough to make my blood run cold. I asked the attendant about it, but he just shook his head and said he didn't know anything about it. I got back in my truck and continued on my way, feeling more uneasy than ever. As I drove deeper into the wilderness, the road became increasingly treacherous. It wound through steep canyons and crossed rickety bridges over rushing rivers. I was starting to regret ever taking this job in the first place. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated a figure in the middle of the road. It was a woman, her hair blowing in the wind, standing completely still. I slowed down and rolled down my window to ask if she needed help. But as I got closer, I realized that something was off. Her skin was ghostly pale, and her eyes were empty and lifeless. She didn't say a word, just stared at me with a cold, calculating gaze. I started to drive away, but she suddenly lunged at my window, her hand scrabbling at the glass. I hit the gas and swerved around her, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop again until I reached my destination, where I immediately quit my job and vowed never to return to that part of the country again. To this day, I still have nightmares about what I saw on that empty highway, and I'm convinced that something truly sinister is lurking in the wilderness of Montana. I've been on the road for years, driving from one city to another, carrying goods and cargo to their destinations. But nothing could have prepared me for the encounter that I had on that one fateful night. It was an experience that still haunts me to this day. It was a typical meet and turn shift, and I had arrived at the designated location an hour before the other driver was scheduled to arrive. The place was dark and deserted, with no signs of life around me. Feeling tired from the long drive, I decided to take a short nap and close my eyes. But my peaceful nap was soon interrupted by the sound of a barking dog. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking that it was just a stray dog wandering around. But as the barking grew louder and closer, I knew that something was not right. I opened my eyes to see what was going on, and what I saw left me terrified. There was a man, inches away from my window, barking at me like a dog. He was a large man, around 35 years old, with wild eyes and frothing at the mouth. His crazed appearance was enough to make me freeze with fear. The man kept barking at me, and it was then that I realized that he was not a man at all, but something else entirely. His behavior was animalistic, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. I knew that I had to get away from him, and I quickly started my truck and pulled away from the scene. But the barking man wasn't going to let me go so easily. He chased after me, running on all fours like a dog, his barks growing louder and more menacing by the second. I was driving as fast as I could, but he seemed to be keeping up with me. I knew that I had to do something to get rid of him. I remembered a small church that was a few miles away, and I decided to head there. As I drove towards the church, I could feel the barking man getting closer and closer, his presence filling me with terror. Finally, I arrived at the church, and I quickly ran inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I could hear the barking man outside, trying to get in, but I knew that I was safe inside the church. But then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The barking man had stopped barking, and I could hear him whispering something in a language that I couldn't understand. It was a voice that was not human, filled with malice and hatred. And then, I heard him laughing, a cold, cruel sound that echoed through the empty church. I knew then that I had to get out of there, and I ran towards the back of the church, hoping to find another exit. But as I turned the corner, I saw something that made me freeze with fear. The barking man was standing there, waiting for me, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. He was no longer a man or an animal, but something far more terrifying. And then, he spoke to me, in a voice that chilled me to the bone. "You cannot escape me," he said. "I am always here, waiting for you. You will never be free from my grasp." And with that, he lunged at me, his jaws snapping shut like a trap. I closed my eyes, ready to accept my fate, but when I opened them again, I was back in my truck, parked in the empty lot. It was as if the whole thing had been a nightmare. But even now, years later, I can still hear the barking man's voice in my head, whispering to me in the dead of night. And I know that he is out there, waiting for me, always watching, always barking. I can never forget that night, and I know that I can never truly escape from the barking man. I was driving down a long, desolate road one night with my 2 young children in the back seat. They were bickering and causing a ruckus, so I pulled over to give them a piece of my mind. As I was in the middle of scolding them, a car pulled up beside me. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see who was inside. But the driver rolled down the window and motioned for me to do the same. "There's been a wreck up ahead, and traffic stopped," the driver said. "You should take this side road as a detour." I was grateful for the advice and thanked the driver. But as they drove away, I started to feel uneasy. I'm from the country, and I know how easy it is to get lost on back roads. I decided to ignore the advice and stick to the main road. As I passed the detour road, I looked over and saw the couple who had given me the advice. They had stopped their car and gotten out, and were now standing in the middle of the road. It was just getting dark, and all I could see was their silhouettes against the woods that surrounded us. I shuddered at the thought of being out there in the darkness, and I drove away quickly. The next morning, as I drove by the same road, I saw a dead E&D sign just past where the couple had gotten out of their car. I couldn't help but wonder why they had suggested that detour if it led to a dead end. And why had they gotten out of their car in the middle of the road? It made no sense to me. As the years went by, I tried to forget about that strange encounter. But every time I drove past that road, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't until 15 years later that I finally found out the truth. I was browsing through old newspaper articles when I came across a story about a couple who had gone missing 15 years ago. They had been on their way to visit family when they took a detour on a back road. Their car was found abandoned on the side of the road, but there was no sign of the couple. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The couple from the night I pulled over was the same couple that had gone missing. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized what could have happened. What if I had taken that detour? Would I have met the same fate as that poor couple? The thought haunted me for weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in my gut. But then one day, as I was driving past the dead-end detour, something caught my eye. I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. It was the same silhouette I had seen all those years ago. I slammed on my brakes and stared at the figure, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. And then, as if on cue, the figure stepped out of the woods and into the light. It was the driver of the car from that fateful night, and they were holding something in their hand. As they got closer, I could see that it was a photograph of the missing couple. The driver held it out to me, and I took it shakily. And then they spoke, their voice cold and emotionless. "You should have taken that detour." I felt a scream building in my throat as I realized the truth. The driver had lured the couple to their deaths, and now they were coming for me. I hit the gas and sped away, but I could feel their eyes on me the entire time. To this day, I can't drive past that dead-end detour without feeling like I'm being watched. I know that the driver is still out there, waiting for their next victim. And I can't help but wonder how many more innocent people have fallen prey to their twisted game. I never believed in ghosts until that fateful night on I-44. My daughter and I were on our way to catch our flight back home to Pennsylvania. It was early in the morning, around 4 a.m., and the highway was empty. We were cruising along when suddenly we saw an old car launch off an embankment, rolling over and over. I could see a human figure flying through the air. I quickly pulled over and called 911, giving them the GPS coordinates of the overpass. The dispatch assured me that an officer was just 2 minutes away and that I should stay put. But when the officer called me back 20 minutes later, he told me that there was nothing there. No skid marks, broken glass, or flattened grass. Nothing at all. Confused and frightened, I went home and started searching for answers. That's when I found out the horrifying truth. Exactly 10 years ago, a group of teenagers lost control of their car and crashed at the same spot where we saw the ghostly accident. All 6 of them were killed in the crash, and they were driving an old 1986 Oldsmobile. The time of their accident? 4:05 a.m. I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw was real, that it wasn't just my imagination playing tricks on me. I became obsessed with the story, and I started researching more about the accident and the teenagers who lost their lives. But the more I delved into it, the more I realized that something was off. The accident happened on a suburban road, not on a highway like I-44. And the car that we saw was not an old 1986 Oldsmobile, but an older model car in light blue or silver. The details didn't match up, but I couldn't ignore the fact that I saw something that night. I started having nightmares, seeing the same old car flying through the air, rolling over and over. I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. That's why I decided to go back to the spot where we saw the accident, to see if I could find any answers. As I pulled up to the overpass, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I got out of the car and walked towards the edge, trying to see if there was any sign of the accident. But again, there was nothing. Just a quiet, empty stretch of road. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, like someone crying. I looked around, trying to find the source of the noise, but there was no one there. Just me and the ghosts of the teenagers who died on that fateful night. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what was happening. The ghosts were trying to communicate with me, to tell me their story. And as I listened to their cries, I felt a deep sadness wash over me. These were young people who had their whole lives ahead of them, but their dreams were cut short by a tragic accident. I knew then that I had to do something to help them. I started a campaign to raise awareness about the dangers of reckless driving, to honor the memory of the teenagers who died on that stretch of road. And as I shared their story with the world, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Maybe, just maybe, their spirits could finally rest in peace. But every once in a while I'm driving down a quiet stretch of highway, I can still hear their cries. The ghosts of the teenagers who lost their lives on that fateful night on I-44. And I know that they will always be with me, haunting me, reminding me to live each day as if it were my last. Because you never know when it could all come crashing down, just like it did for them. The haunted highway will forever be a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. And while the ghosts may never fully rest, their story will continue to inspire and drive change, one driver at a time. I was driving through Kansas on a dark and stormy night. The rain was pouring down and I could barely see the road ahead of me. I was making my way down I-70 when the storm got so bad that the road started flooding. I knew I had to pull over and wait it out, so I pulled into a service plaza and parked my truck. As I sat there watching the storm, there was a series of lightning strikes followed by a complete blackout. I was alone in the dark, and all I could hear was the sound of rain pounding against the roof of my truck. Suddenly, a bright light started moving behind the clouds. It was too slow to be an aircraft, but too fast to be a part of the storm system. The light moved up over the hills and trees before crossing directly overhead, illuminating everything in an eerie blue glow. It was so bright, it cast shadows of the trees and buildings around me. I couldn't believe my eyes. I seriously thought I was witnessing an alien invasion. The light disappeared behind the service plaza, and the whole transit from the tree line to the plaza took maybe 5 to 10 minutes tops. While it was overhead, the parking lot was lit up like daylight. I was frozen in fear, wondering what could possibly be happening. As the light disappeared, the rain stopped and the parking lot lights came back on. It was like someone had flipped a switch. I was terrified and decided to get out of there as fast as I could. As I drove away, I couldn't help but look in my rearview mirror for any sign of spaceships or aliens walking the earth. I finally arrived at a motel and got some sleep, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that I wasn't alone. I felt like there was an unseen presence following me, watching my every move. It was as if something had taken control of my mind, and I couldn't escape it. The next day, I continued my journey and put the strange incident behind me. However, a few weeks later, I started experiencing nightmares that were so vivid, it felt like they were real. I dreamed of the strange light, and the feeling of being watched followed me everywhere I went. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was haunting me. One day, while I was driving down a quiet road, I saw the same eerie blue light again. This time, it was closer, and I could hear strange noises coming from it. I quickly turned my truck around and headed back to town, my heart racing with fear. I realized that whatever had happened that night in Kansas wasn't just a freak occurrence. There was something out there, something that was following me, and it wasn't human. I didn't know what to do or where to turn, but I knew I had to find a way to escape the unseen presence that had taken hold of my life. As I continued my journey, I could feel the presence growing stronger. It was as if it was trying to take control of me, to possess me. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. I finally reached my destination, but I knew that I wasn't safe. The unseen presence was still there, watching me, waiting for its chance to take over. I knew that I had to find a way to break free from its grasp before it was too late. To this day, I don't know what that light was, or what it wanted from me. But I do know that I'll never forget that night in Kansas, and the unseen presence that followed me home. I still remember the night vividly, even after 20 years. I was driving home from work, exhausted after working a double shift. The freeway was almost empty, and I felt my eyelids getting heavier by the second. I tried turning up the radio and rolling down the windows, but nothing seemed to help. The last thing I remembered was the sound of the radio before I fell asleep. And then, I heard a woman's voice. It was a gentle whisper in my ear, "Wake up." It was just loud enough to wake me up, but not startle me awake. I opened my eyes and saw the construction barrels right in front of me. I swerved and managed to avoid them, and then pulled over to the side of the road. I looked around, but there was no one there. I was alone on the freeway. I rubbed my eyes and checked my watch. I had been asleep for only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. I tried to shake off the feeling and continued driving. But the voice stayed with me. It echoed in my head, and I couldn't get it out. I thought about it for the rest of the drive home, and even after I got home. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even my wife. I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, strange things started happening. Every time I drove on that same stretch of the freeway, I would hear the same whisper. It was always the same voice, always saying the same thing, "Wake up." I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It was like the voice was calling out to me. One night, I decided to stop and investigate. I got out of my car and walked around, but there was no one there. I checked under the hood and even looked inside the trunk, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I started to feel uneasy, like someone was watching me. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, a few feet away from me. She was wearing a white dress, and her hair was long and black. She had a sad expression on her face, and her eyes were fixed on me. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen in place, staring back at her. And then, she started walking towards me. Her steps were slow and deliberate, and I could hear them echoing on the pavement. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. She was right in front of me now, and I could feel her breath on my face. I could see the pain in her eyes, and I knew that she was trying to tell me something. And then, she disappeared. I was alone again, standing on the side of the freeway. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew that it was something beyond my understanding. From that night on, I never heard the voice again. But I knew that she was still out there, watching over me. And sometimes, when I'm driving on the freeway, I catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye. I know that she's trying to protect me, just like she did that night 20 years ago. But I still wonder, who was she? Why did she choose me? And what was she trying to tell me? I guess I'll never know the answers to those questions. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the whispers on the freeway. As a teenager, I was obsessed with the local legend of Spook Road. It was said that a car full of kids had crashed and died on that road, and their ghosts still haunted the place. The dash of the car was still at the site, a chilling reminder of the tragedy that had occurred. One night, my friends and I decided to visit the road. We drove there in my car, with the radio blasting and our hearts racing with excitement. We didn't believe in ghosts, but we wanted to experience the thrill of being on the haunted road. As we drove down the road, we noticed something strange. Time seemed to be moving differently. We were driving at 30 miles per hour, but somehow we had taken a 15-minute drive and had listened to an entire album. It was as though time had slowed down, or maybe even stopped. We brushed it off as a weird coincidence and continued driving. But as we got closer to the site of the crash, things started to get eerie. The air around us grew colder, and the trees on the side of the road rustled even though there was no wind. We saw the dash of the car up ahead, and my heart started racing. We had all heard the stories about the ghostly apparitions that were said to appear there. But as we got closer, we realized that something was off. The dash was not in the same place as it had been the last time we were there. We stopped the car and got out, our eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of the ghosts. And then, we heard it. It was a faint whisper, almost like a breeze. We couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sent shivers down our spines. Suddenly, the trees around us started shaking violently, and we heard the sound of breaking branches. We knew we had to get out of there, but our car wouldn't start. We tried to push it, but it wouldn't budge. That's when we saw them. The ghosts of the kids who had died in the crash. They were standing right in front of us, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They didn't say anything, but we could feel their anger and pain. We tried to run, but we couldn't move. It was like we were frozen in place, trapped in their grip. And then, they started to close in on us. Their faces contorted into angry expressions, and we could see the pain and suffering in their eyes. Just as they were about to grab us, a bright light shone from behind us. It was a police car, and the officers had come to investigate the strange activity on the road. The ghosts disappeared into the darkness, and we were free. We tried to explain what had happened, but the officers didn't believe us. They thought we were just a bunch of kids playing a prank. But we knew the truth. We had encountered the ghosts of the Spook Road, and they had almost claimed us as their own. Years later, I still can't explain what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure. The haunted Spook Road is real, and it's not a place for the faint of heart. If you ever find yourself driving down that road, beware. The ghosts of the past are still there, and they will stop at nothing to claim their victims. I've always hated driving by the graveyard at night on my way home. The empty road leading up to it always made me feel uneasy, and the looming tombstones seemed to stare at me as I drove by. But what I hated most of all was the feeling of being watched. It was like something was waiting for me, and it wasn't something I wanted to meet. One night, I was driving home late from work, and as I passed the graveyard, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I could see that it was a man. He looked sad and lost, like he had nowhere else to go. Suddenly, he jumped into the back seat of my car, and I could feel his weight shift the car. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and to my horror, I saw him sitting there, looking right at me. He was solid and real, not like any ghost I'd ever seen in the movies. I screamed and slammed on the brakes, but he didn't budge. He just sat there, staring at me. It was as if he didn't even know he was dead. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I was trapped in the car with this ghost, and there was no way out. As I drove home, the ghost stayed in the back seat, silently watching me. I could feel his eyes on me, and it was the most unnerving feeling I had ever experienced. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I jumped out of the car and ran into my house, locking the door behind me. For weeks, I was too scared to drive by the graveyard at night. I took different routes home, even if it meant adding extra time to my commute. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ghost was still watching me. One day, I was telling my nephew about my experience, and he looked at me with a shocked expression on his face. He told me that he had a similar experience driving by the same graveyard. The only difference was that he had a way of dealing with the ghost. He said that whenever the ghost tried to get in his car, he would say, "If you ain't Jesus, get the hell out of my car." According to my nephew, the ghost would then disappear, leaving him alone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Had we both encountered the same ghost? Was he haunting the graveyard, waiting for someone to give him a ride home? I decided to try my nephew's trick the next time I drove by the graveyard. As I approached the entrance, I could feel my heart racing. But I took a deep breath, and as I drove by the spot where the ghost had first appeared, I said the words, "If you ain't Jesus, get the hell out of my car." To my surprise, the ghost disappeared instantly. It was like he was never there. I don't know what happened to the ghost, but I'm grateful that I never saw him again. The experience was so terrifying that I can still feel the chill down my spine whenever I drive by the graveyard at night. It's like I can still feel his presence, watching me from beyond the grave, waiting for his next ride. I had just finished a late shift at work and was driving home on a dark, deserted road. It was 3 a.m. in the morning, and I was exhausted. All I wanted to do was get home, crawl into bed, and forget about the world for a few hours. As I drove along, I noticed a truck behind me with no lights on. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming that the driver had simply forgotten to turn on their lights. But as I continued to drive, the truck remained behind me, following my every move. I tried to shake it off, but the truck stayed with me, its headlights still off. I felt a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. It was like I was being pursued by some unknown force, and I had no idea why. My mind raced, and all I could think of was the movie Jeepers Creepers. The scene where the two siblings are pursued by a mysterious truck, trying to run them off the road. I shuddered at the thought. As I drove on, I could see the silhouette of the driver in the truck's cab. He was huge, with broad shoulders and a thick neck. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel his eyes on me. I knew I had to do something, but what? I was miles away from civilization, and my phone had no signal. I was completely alone. Suddenly, the truck started to accelerate, and I felt it closing in on me. I could hear the sound of the engine revving, and the tires screeching on the road. It was like the driver was trying to push me off the road. I tried to speed up, but the truck matched my every move. It was like it was playing a game of cat and mouse with me, and I was losing. Just as I thought it was all over, I saw a light in the distance. It was the sign of a gas station. I knew I had to get there if I wanted to survive. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and drove as fast as I could. The truck was right behind me, but I could see the gas station getting closer and closer. As I pulled into the station, the truck screeched to a stop behind me. I jumped out of my car and ran into the gas station, screaming for help. The clerk looked at me with a puzzled expression on his face, but as he turned around, he saw the truck outside. He knew something was wrong. He called the police, and within minutes, they arrived on the scene. The driver of the truck was arrested, and it turned out he had been following me for no reason at all. He was just a random stranger, trying to scare me. The experience left me shaken, and I never forgot the feeling of being pursued by something unknown. It was like a nightmare had come to life, and I had to fight to survive. Now, whenever I drive alone at night, I always check my rearview mirror. I never want to be caught off guard again, and I never want to experience that feeling of terror and helplessness. The pursuit was a warning to me, a reminder that there are always dangers lurking in the darkness, waiting to pounce when we least expect it. I had heard about the haunted road from a friend who had shared the story with me in hushed tones over drinks. Apparently, if you drove down this particular stretch of road at night and turned your lights on and off under the bridge, you might catch a glimpse of the ghost of a girl who had hung herself there years ago. It was a dare I couldn't resist. So one night, I decided to take the plunge and explore the road. It was a dark and moonless night, and the only light came from my headlights as they illuminated the road ahead. The trees on either side of the road loomed large, and there was a sense of foreboding in the air. I slowed down as I approached the bridge, my heart pounding with anticipation. I turned my headlights off, then on again, 3 times in rapid succession, just as my friend had instructed. For a moment, nothing happened. I started to feel disappointed, as though I'd been duped. But then, something caught my eye. I saw a shadowy figure hanging from the bridge, swaying gently in the breeze. It was the girl my friend had spoken of. My heart raced, and I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, eager to get away from the haunted road. As I sped down the road, I heard a loud banging sound coming from behind me. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw a truck with no lights following me. My first thought was that it was just someone else who wanted to see the ghost, but as the truck got closer, I started to feel a sense of dread. The truck was getting closer, and I could see that there were several people inside. They were all wearing black hoodies, and I couldn't see their faces. They started banging on the windows of my car, and I could hear their voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I panicked and stepped on the gas, but the truck kept pace with me. I tried to lose them, but they stayed right behind me. It was as if they were chasing me. I didn't know what to do. As I drove, I noticed that the road seemed to be getting narrower and narrower. The trees on either side were closing in, and I could barely see where I was going. I was in a complete panic now, and I felt like I was going to crash. Suddenly, the road opened up again, and I saw a small town in the distance. I drove as fast as I could, hoping to find some help there. But when I arrived, the town was deserted. It was like a ghost town. I got out of my car and started walking down the main street, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could help me. But there was no one around. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. And then, out of nowhere, the truck appeared again. It was parked in the middle of the street, blocking my path. The people in the truck got out, and I could see their faces now. They were all wearing masks, and they were all holding knives. I turned and ran, but they chased after me. I could hear their footsteps getting closer and closer. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, with no escape. Suddenly, I woke up. It was all just a dream. But as I sat up in bed, covered in sweat, I realized that the fear I felt in my dream was all too real. I had never been so scared in my life. And I knew that I would never, ever drive down that haunted road again.